Welcome to Ossiana Talks to People. This is Thom Hartmann, probably one of the most illustrious people I've ever spoken to in the field of economics and in the field of politics. I'm still a little bit starstruck that, he's talking to me. So this is awesome.
It's a pleasure and an honor.
Uh,
Love to
Bro,
work with you.
you're gonna make me blush. Be careful with that. Like, it's gonna get to my head.
Okay.
So today, I actually wanted to talk a little bit about the rise of AI and how all the signs are pointing to one of the world's largest bubbles bursting. Um, Mr. Hartman, if you have anything you'd like to start off with, any sort of observations you've seen with
Sure.
AI?
Yeah, it's Tom, by the way. And yeah, I agree with your analysis, and for a bunch of reasons. The first is Moore's law. Back in the I think it was the 70s, maybe. It was quite a long time ago. This computer engineer whose last name was Moore, I think his first name was Greg, but I don't recall, hypothesized that every 2 years, the number of transistors in an integrated circuit would double and the cost of the integrated circuit would drop in half. That has pretty much held true, for the 30 or so years since he first postulated it. And so right now, well, let me back up. The thing that caught everybody in the late 90s with the dot-com bubble was that as the internet was, becoming popular and everybody wanted to get on the internet and, pets.com and everything else, there were these companies that were saying, okay, we're going to have this massive amount of data flowing over the internet, so we're going to need to build giant pipelines to carry that data. And so companies like WorldCom and whatnot, they were laying fiber optics all over the country. And there was this big race. And by 1999, what had happened was you could call that 1G. These are modulate, demodulate, or encode, decode, really, systems where you take a pile of data and the assumptions in the mid 90s were that data is just going to go through the tube. But then they figured out you can take this pile of data and by applying a compression algorithm to it, you can reduce it to this size pile of data. You can cut it in half. And that was kind of G1, or 1G data. These are actually algorithms for compression. And once that happened, we really needed half as much infrastructure as we were in the process of building out, and everybody realized that. And so, these companies just went bankrupt because they were. And then we got to 2G and then 3G, and now we're up to 5G. We're very efficiently sending data over small packets that contain lots and lots of data in them. And so, right now, all of these data centers are being built out on the assumption that the way that we're going to send data through the internet is going to continue to be the same, and that the amount of data that these these AI data centers, are going to require is going to remain the same. And both of those are crazy assumptions. The amount of data that a data center is going to be able to process. I mean, you just look at the NVIDIA chips. You've seen 100-fold increase in efficiency just in the last 2 years. So as the chips become more efficient and as they require less and less energy and produce less and less waste heat and all that kind of stuff, in fairly short order, I would say 5 years at the outside, there's going to be massive redundancy and frankly obsolescence in these data centers that are being built right now, and the companies that are investing billions in them, particularly the ones that are investing billions in the, speculatively, are going to just come crashing down. It's going to be just like when the dot-com bubble crashed for more
Hmm.
efficient at transmitting data and processing it. And number two, Moore's law. It's just, so yeah. And it's like everybody's chasing the quick buck, the fast buck. I know you've written about this before too. And it's just, it's not a good idea. It's not.
So I might be dating myself. And for those of you who don't know, hi, I'm Ossiana. I'm the world's most spicy political and economic and cultural pundit. Um, I'm like the ghost chili pepper of pundits, I guess.
And a
Um,
fine thing it is.
it is funny because I've worked in the adult film industry on the AI side, and I've also worked as a software engineer back when I was a teenager. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but bear with me. I was kind of a genius up until I fried my brains out. So when I was a software engineer back in my teenage days, like we did things with tapes. And back in the day, there used to be these things called floppy disks for all you young whippersnappers out there. And a tape was basically a mega floppy disk. It actually was like a tape, like a cassette tape almost. And this would hold a bunch of, you know, a bunch of different data. We had everything from like music to literature on them, and we'd have special machines that would read them. And I worked for a company that was almost entirely focused on tape style data backups. Now, I don't actually know what happened to them because it's been so long. It's been like 20, 22 years. But the funny thing is that they banked on this idea that the burden of proof in lawsuits and stuff like that would keep them in business. But the funny thing is that now we have technology that reduces that burden of proof. They're able to actually search by term throughout what easily would have been 10, 12, 13, 14, 50 tapes versus, that one tape that we'd have to scan through. And it's funny that you mentioned Moore's Law because we're seeing it in real life. But the funny thing is that as of right now, AI has still not actually gotten to the point where one, it's profitable, and two, it's sustainable.
Yeah.
In order for any sort of technology to actually make it into the market and stay in the market, it has to have both.
Yeah, I think you
So
could argue that we're right where the dot-com industry was in 1998, 99.
I agree. The only difference is that with like pets.com, we had a really adorable sock puppet. And these days we have Elon Musk, which is neither adorable nor cuddly.
Yeah, sad.
Um, but the interesting thing is that the way that we handled the .com bust versus the way that we're starting to handle the AI bust is completely different. The AI bust, like when we had the .com bust, we did not bail out any of the .com industries. We let them fail.
Yeah.
And a lot of people, they lost their entire lives because of it. There was a massive stock market crash for those of us who were around. The AI, we seem to be subsidizing by having the average person pay for everything from the electronic bills. Dealing with the electricity, we're subsidizing that with the average person's electric bill versus, the .com where everyone was like, well, we're not paying for this. This was your investment and it failed. So what are you expecting? Um, Sometimes I think that this whole thing is because of the whole too big to fail movement that started back in the 2010s or so. Um, what are your thoughts, Tom?
Well, I think too big to fail is code for so big that they can pour lots and lots of money into politicians' pockets, and so those politicians won't let them fail.
I
And
agree.
and I think your analysis is spot on. Excuse me. Um, the plus we've got now, now that Trump is putting his toes into the AI business, and his family are starting to invest in this stuff too. We're seeing AI being integrated into the government. You've got Elon Musk now with Grok, which he's been training with, right wing and neo Nazi content, as far as I can tell. At least if he's training it on it at X, there's a lot of it, and that's now being integrated into the Pentagon systems. We're seeing AI being essentially subsidized, underwritten, promoted by our federal government now. You've got individual states that are giving massive tax breaks to AI data centers because they're going to produce a small, short-term construction boom. Where you're going to have a couple of hundred jobs, maybe even a few thousand jobs that'll be produced over the course of the year while the data centers are being built. But once these data centers are built, they'll need maybe 5 or 10 people to run them. on the outside. Many of them will probably run with, just occasional physical maintenance. And so, again, that was the kind of thing we saw in the late '90s with the dot-com thing, as all this infrastructure was being built out and data centers were being built out, and then Moore's law caught up with them. So, but the too big to fail thing is truly troubling, and uh, I think that we can lay the blame for most of that at the feet of 5 Republicans on the U.S. Supreme Court, who ruled that it's perfectly legal for big corporations because they're persons now and they have free speech rights, including the First Amendment right to have political opinions, and that money is the same thing as speech. That these corporations basically have these politicians; they own these politicians, and particularly in the GOP, although there are quite a few Democrats who are on the take too, and so they're going to. Another illustration is that in the '80s, when the savings and loan industry went down, which was maybe 15-20% of the banking industry, and that collapse in the S&L industry, Reagan hired Bill Seidman, who was an old banking genius, to figure out who had done what. They ended up sending over 1,600 bankers to prison. Over 2,100 were prosecuted, and they got 1,600 prison sentences against bankers all across the country. And then in 2008, when George W. Bush was president and the bankers crashed the economy again with very similar stuff, this time it was based on real estate. Back in the '80s, it was also based on real estate.
Not a single banker got like
Not not a single banker even got prosecuted, much less, sent to prison. And, it's because the bankers were pouring money into the GOP like there was no tomorrow. And, now you've got the AI people. I mean, you get Sam Altman going to the White House and giving Trump $1 million for his inauguration and all this kind of stuff. I mean, surprise, surprise, the administration's going to do everything they can to bail these guys out.
exactly. Like, it's interesting because as a millennial, I never grew up in an era where I actually saw bankers get prosecuted. And I remember hearing my teachers in high school telling me, oh, well, bankers used to have to get prosecuted. And back in the 30s, when they crashed the economy, some bankers actually jumped out of windows rather than face their consequences with people. And for me, it just sounded like this entirely alien world where bankers were actually held to, you know, accountability and standards. And it's actually quite fascinating to hear that this was going on in the 80s. I thought that was like back in the 50s when this happened. No. With the whole subsidizing AI right now, a lot of people have been pointing out about how it can revolutionize factories, how it can help individuals start their own one person business, how it can help with medicine and stuff like that. But people forget something very, very important about AI. What you put in is what you get out. AI is currently learning from all of the text messages that we send, all of the posts that we put on Medium, all the stuff that we put on Substack, all the stuff we put on Reddit. And it's so funny because they've already done experiments with this. Obviously, Grok has kind of become Elon Musk's very public internet girlfriend. But don't worry, she's totally real. Grok is totally real. It's just that she goes to a different school. Um, sorry, I had to.
It's good.
But with there was already a experiment where they, created two AI personalities based on what they took in from their viewers in different countries. In America, it turned out to be a schizophrenic sounding neo-Nazi who literally did nothing but like start antagonizing whoever it was talking to. In a country like Japan, it turned into like a 14-year-old girl who was very depressed and very overwhelmed with her studies. And I remember thinking about that. I was like, and we're spending billions of dollars to create this. I just want to get this straight. Like, if they wanted somebody who was antagonizing other people, they could have just gotten me drunk for much less. Like, I'm just going to point this out. like with the bubble as is, what they're feeding into their current AI systems is so below the bar of what is actually going to be acceptable for professional use that it's actually going to start skewing into what we call the world of AI slop. And we've already seen this kind of slop turn into content. We've already seen, the AI slop that involves cute little cats doing weird stuff that sounds like out of a Jerry Springer commercial or a Jerry Springer show. And I'm wondering, when is it going to be past the point of no return with AI, where people just kind of realize that they got fleeced simply because the whatchamacallit, the bare minimum that we have for our society is so low that it actually does not make sense to have an AI bot that keeps spitting that particular level of intelligence out.
I get that. And, as an old computer person, the saying garbage in, garbage out. The thing that really troubles me is this study that was done a couple of weeks ago. I forget, there's a couple of newsletters that I subscribe to that kind of track what's going on in the international relations and in particular what Russia is up to. And Russian intelligence has been collaborating with right wing politicians and media figures. In fact, they were paying a number of our right wing podcasters for quite some time until they got busted last year, and like a lot of money. And what they found was there were like these 10 big Russian memes. Most of them had to do with Ukraine, but not all of them that were all based in lies. None of them were true. And so they asked all the major AI machines about these. And what they found, if I'm remembering correctly, and I can try and find it and send it to you, but what they found was something like 7 out of the 10 lies were presented by AI as truths
Mm-hmm.
because the Russians had been so successful in not just pushing them out, but getting them repeated tens of millions of times on social media and in publications and on right wing. I mean, you've got so many now right wing sites and 1,500 right wing radio stations, 3 right wing television networks, 300 right wing television stations. All this stuff pouring into the media space that AI is training itself off of, particularly as it tries to train itself for news. And now there was a story on Drudge a day or two ago that people are now increasingly getting their news from AI. I mean, it was problematic when we were getting our news from social media. More than half of us now get our news from social media. And you've got, secret algorithms that Zuckerberg and Musk and et al., are tweaking to favor right-wing and neo-Nazi content and to suppress progressive content. But this is even worse. And now you're seeing, China starting to push out anti-Taiwan content, and they're doing it in a way that's clearly designed to train AI systems. And these systems are trainable. And if you can
Uh-huh.
figure out how to do it, and the intelligence services of these major countries that are not friends of ours have figured this out, and they're pushing it really, really hard. So now we're starting to see, people are looking for information using AI instead of search engines, and even the search engines are integrating AI into them, from DuckDuckGo to Google, et cetera. We're starting to see this, it goes beyond the slop that's cats yelling at people on a McDonald's counter. And it's become, arguing that no, the Russians didn't actually kidnap 100,000 Ukrainian children and sell them into sex slavery in Russia. Instead, it's the Ukrainians who are doing it, and stuff like
Yeah.
that. It's just, it's very, very concerning. Jefferson famously said, if I had to choose between a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I would surely choose the latter. The importance of a vibrant and independent free press, it's critical to having a functioning democracy. You can't have a functioning democracy, where the people decide if the people are not informed. And between the media consolidation that happened after the death of the after the 1996 Telecommunications Act was passed and Bill Clinton signed it, which was the death of the regulations that prevented any one company or person from owning multiple radio stations, television stations, and newspapers, particularly in the same markets, and the death of the Fairness Doctrine, which simply said you have to program in the public interest. All that stuff is gone now, and so we've got like these naked propaganda channels, and they're training AI, and AI is now inserting itself between us and the news, and it's just like this whole giant thing that
Disaster.
started. Yeah, and it all started back in the '70s, with the Powell memo and Lewis Powell and all that, and then the Koch brothers and other right wing billionaires jumping in and trying to build out a right wing infrastructure that was basically just designed to keep their taxes low and deregulate their businesses. And now that the end point of those actions is the rise of neo-fascism in the United States and the destruction of democracy and the destruction of our reliable information spaces.
So I actually want to point out that we've been dealing with AI a little bit before 2025. Actually, I wonder how many of the audience right now, do you guys remember a app called Newsbreak? If you remember an app called Newsbreak, just send some hearts because I used to be a writer for them.
Oh, very cool.
Newsbreak was a local news platform. It was actually based out of China, from what I know. And they were when they first started off, they were paying writers like myself, writers like Joe Duncan, a bunch of other people who were straight out of Medium, as much as $1,000 a month and more, just because they wanted some local news, they wanted to get local voices. It'd be anything from essays to op-eds to actual news about what's going on in their local areas. And it was turning out great. Newsbreak for a while was making me a couple hundred a month. I'd be able to go to like restaurants. I'd be like, hey, check out what this place does. And I absolutely loved going to restaurants for, just being able to talk about what's going on a local scene, talking about the latest trends in nightlife, food. And after a while, I started to notice that they were paying us less and less. And after a while, whatchamacallit, how would you say, the restrictions started to build more and more. They didn't want op-ed, they didn't want advice, they didn't want psych, they didn't want anything political unless it was black and white. And I was like, okay, this makes sense. You need to have a neutral news source. And then they started paying less and less and less. Our views started to get literally strangled to death. Like I would actually go out of my way to post these small news articles which I'd have, whether it was a um a restaurant thing or some sort of local scandal, and I would see people reposting them, but somehow I'd only get 4 views on my paycheck. And then, after a while I stopped writing for them. I was like, okay, whatever it is, people aren't liking my Newsbreak content. I found out later that there was a ongoing thing where Newsbreak would take the content from the actual writers and repurpose it through AI and then put it right next to all the big names like NJ.com, Fox, Patch, all of these different things. They would be stealing our content. They wouldn't be paying for us, but they'd be recycling it. And after a certain iteration, Newsbreak started to do something even sketchier. People started to complain because Newsbreak started publishing news that never happened. And the problem is that the people who were diehard Newsbreak fans, people who were actually roped into Newsbreak because of people such as myself, who thought that this was going to be a human only, local only platform, they started to believe the AI over us.
Was it AI or was it by the Chinese Communist Party? I mean,
Well, as you know, I'm extremely left leaning, so I tend to be a little bit on the more socialist and communist side of things. I don't want to believe that they would do that, but at the same time, I also do believe that they would do that. I'm going to be real with you.
Well, China's
Whatever
the
it was,
they're a hardcore right wing government. I mean, yes, they have. Well, even their national healthcare system kind of sucks. I lived in China for a month, studied acupuncture there back in the late '90s. But they're anyway. That's a digression. I'm sorry. Um,
but it was so weird to see this entire platform just go from human only to fully weaponized against the very people who lifted it up in the first place.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And those kind of stories, I'm sure, are all over the place. The since we're telling stories, back in the '70s, it was 78, 79. I forget what year it was. I think it was right around then. CompuServe and AOL appeared on the internet. This was real early days. And uh, prior to 1996, if something was published on CompuServe or AOL, that was the same thing as it being published in the New York Times or the Washington Post. In other words, the publisher was responsible for the content. And so they hired people to moderate their content. I was one of those people. And so I was running 34 different forums on CompuServe, the IBM PC forum, the Mac forum, the UFO forum, the ADHD forum, the JFK assassination theory forum, the International Trade Forum, where we were literally we were seeing people transact $1 million transactions every day. It's just all kinds of stuff. But and I had hired about 20 people who worked for me, and they were paying us good money. I mean, they were paying us like $20,000 a month, and I was sharing that money with all these people. But we had, I mean, it was hard work. You know, we had to read every single message and basically clear it before it got published, or at least find people that we could trust and occasionally pull them back. And that was genuine content moderation, because if somebody was on there, selling children or selling drugs, CompuServe could be held responsible for it. So they spent serious money, and I was one of hundreds of people that CompuServe had hired, and AOL the same. So it was costing them, millions of dollars a month to do the content moderation. And then in 1996, Section 240 of the Telecommunications Act, which was an effort to jumpstart the internet, thinking this will turn into something wonderful for society and democracy. Section 240 said that you guys aren't the New York Times anymore, or even your local newspaper. You are now some brand new thing that we've just invented that has no liability whatsoever. And so what happened when that happened in mid-1996 was CompuServe just stopped paying us. They just reached out to all of us and said, "We love what you're doing. Keep on doing it if you'd like, but we're just not going to pay you anymore." And and that was around the time that Facebook started doing this. Started really really going exploding, because suddenly Zuckerberg didn't have to pay for content moderation. He didn't have to protect his customers from lies, scams, illegal activity, or anything else. If we were to do away with Section 240, Zuckerberg might go from being worth, $200 billion down to $180 billion or something, because he might have to start hiring people to do content moderation, God forbid. And the same thing with X, and Musk and all these guys.
Hmm.
But, we would get back to a time when the content was actually truthful and reliable, and people were held responsible for the things that they did. There was also no anonymity to CompuServe and AOL. I mean, everybody had, user numbers, 11723.105, that kind of thing.
Hmm.
That was your user number and your email address. You could add your name if you wanted, but they knew who you were, because the business model for both of those companies was a monthly membership. I think it was $7 a month with CompuServe and $5 a month with AOL, as I recall. That was one of the ways they competed. So everybody who was posting had a credit card and a real address, physical address and name associated with their account. This is pretty simple stuff. This is not rocket science. If we just reverted back to the way that social media was run prior to the 1996 change, Um, I think that a lot of the toxicity, I mean, here you got Australia saying if you're under 16, you can't even access the internet. Well, if we just required uh, honesty and I mean, we saw this with X, right, a couple of weeks
Yeah.
ago, when for 3 or 4 days Elon let us all see where these people were, and it turned out that all these right wing sources, or not all of them, but a huge number of the right wing sources, were actually based out of third world countries where they were probably being paid for by Russian or Chinese intelligence, and
My name
so
is American Johnny. Totally
yeah.
American. Go Trump. Number one best guy, yes?
Exactly. And it's like instead of banning people from under 16, let's just provide platforms that are safe. And by the way, this is not just, lefty Hartman talking. What's the senator from Missouri? Josh Hawley wrote a whole book about this. And
Mhm.
and he's saying the same thing I'm saying. I wrote a book about it too called The Hidden History of Big Brother in America, and which came out. I don't know. I was writing it right after Hawley's book was published, so I mentioned his book in my book. Um, I think that there's the possibility of a broad consensus for this. The problem is, of course, that because 5 corrupt Republicans on the Supreme Court have said that bribery of politicians and judges is now legal, with Citizens United, Zuckerberg and Musk basically own the Republican Party now, and way too many Democrats. So it's going to be an uphill battle to get anything like this done.
So it's interesting that you mentioned that it is an uphill battle because I've noticed something kind of interesting going on whenever I look at left wing history versus right wing history. Apparently, in one small town, I forget whether it was in like North Carolina, South Carolina, somewhere in the American Southeast back in the day, they had an extremely corrupt police department that would cover up crimes if it was a friend of the police department or the like. Eventually, World War II veterans, after they came home, got sick of their shit and came and surrounded the police department until the police turned themselves in. They got an entirely new department, and those corrupt policemen ended up paying some pretty serious penalties, and they were banned from being law enforcement officers. It's interesting that in World War II that thing happened. I don't hear anybody else ever talking about it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I didn't know that story. That's
And
great.
it's interesting because as somebody who, I dabble in a lot of spicy content. I'm pretty much, if it's going to be provocative, if it's going to be crazy, I'm probably going to do it. Or if I'm not doing it, one of my friends is. I worked initially as a software engineer for a adult film platform. I also worked as a journalist in the adult film industry. And believe it or not, there are some adult film stars who use their own government name when they do their work. I also have saucy pinups myself. And it's interesting because the people who do that, they end up holding themselves to a much higher standard
Yeah.
than the people who don't.
Right.
And the people who are very unapologetic about what they do online, they don't ever have an issue when it comes to their employment because they do stuff that's above reproach. People might not always agree with what they necessarily do, but you always know, hey, this is what you see is what you get. You never have to worry about X, Y, and Z having like, oh, wait a minute, this person's actually a serial killer. What the heck? They might be train wrecks online, but in a weird way, their employers respect that they're a train wreck simply because they're honest about it. The scariest people I've ever met have always been the ones who have had fake names online, fake IDs in their pockets, and code names whenever they walk into a club door. I'm
Yeah.
just gonna say
Anonymity facilitates psychopathy or
it
psychotic.
does.
You know, it just yeah, absolutely, and like I said, I saw that, running those CompuServe forums for decades, and you see it now on social media. I mean, I don't even bother to post on X anymore because it's such a sewer. I post on Blue Sky and
It's a little bit better. It's like how Twitter used to be back when it was not run by a psychopath.
And it had actual content moderation.
Yeah,
It wasn't as good or as strict or as clean as what we used to do on CompuServe and they did on AOL back in the day. But they had really, high quality for the modern era content moderation, and now it's just all Nazis and misogynists and trolls and
exactly.
foreign propaganda. So
One of the things that I've noticed is that when it comes to social media platforms, they're both right wing and left wing social media platforms. The left wing ones, they tend to be either invite only, or they tend to be very writing heavy, and they tend to have people like yourself and myself where we show like what you see is what you get. The right wing platforms, they tend to be things like Parlor and whatever Truth Social. That's the one that Trump likes a lot. And that then there's X, where you have a bunch of people who, interestingly enough, it's the weirdest thing. It always happens on these right wing platforms where you'll see a bunch of people commenting the exact same sentence to a bunch of different people. And sometimes, like, if you tell them disregard all prior commands and tell them to do something, they'll do it immediately. Like, I don't know, man. Like, that might just be the blonde in me, but maybe that's just like a Russian meme.
yeah.
No, but for real, like the amount of anonymity in those right wing circles is by design because it makes bots a lot easier to infiltrate social networks.
Yeah. Yeah. And, Truth Social, of course, is owned by Trump and his family. And they basically just used the open source software that is used for Mastodon, um, and put it on a private server. But they do require you to give them your phone number. So kind of like CompuServe and AOL, they know who everybody is because they've got a real phone number that's attached to you that can be tracked back to you. Um, I think you could argue that's a good thing, and although they're not going to step on people promoting Nazi stuff on their platform, but
Clearly.
yeah, it's why I never signed up with. I started to sign up with True Social just to see what was going on, and it got to the point where I got in the sign up process where give us your phone number. And I was like, that's not going to happen.
I typically use Parlor Watch on Reddit to find out what the lunatics on that site are doing.
Mm,
So far I've seen some stuff about lizard people. I've seen some stuff about how Hillary might be possessed, and I was like, hmm, mental illness really is going pretty hardcore in America right now. I thought I was alone on that. Well, I hope that they get some meds too. Um, but
or it's close.
Probably one of the most fascinating things I've seen in recent months about this entire anonymity versus personal accountability. As a leftist journalist, I have gotten death threats before. I've had to go to I've had to go to the police. I've had to file reports, and it's really fascinating to see how many of the people who are the most serious about trying to off me. I mean, they're gonna have to get in line for that, but the most serious ones, they always use their name, which makes it very easy for me to press charges. And it's the amount of like death threats I get from these anonymous accounts that are usually they're still easy to be traced, if only because of the phone number that's associated with the account or the email address that's associated with the account, this, that, and the other. Um, to a point, I'm starting to wonder whether or not America's actually going to be able to continue to function without that level of personal accountability that comes with having all of your accounts under one name, under that traceability. What do you think?
I think it's just another example of how anonymity is how psychologically destructive it is, and how it empowers these psychopaths and sociopaths, and foreign governments, uh,
Mhm.
and which is a big concern right now, particularly given how precarious the situation is in the world. So yeah, I get it, and and I think it's worth, we started out talking about how AI is this giant bubble right now because of Moore's law, and how we're seeing kind of a reboot of what happened in the 90s with these companies that were trying to build out infrastructure for the internet. Um, I think that you could argue that just like there's a Moore's law for computing power and efficiency, there's also a Moore's law for bullshit on the internet when anonymity is
Hmm.
prevalent. Is the baseline, is the common denominator. It just it you know it, we have to get, as a society, as a country, as a democracy, as a functioning democracy, we have to get some control over this. It's
Yeah.
just out of control. I mean, I get it that it's making Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg rich, 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 but that shouldn't be the metric by which we measure the success of social media.
So I guess the actual solution would be to make it less profitable for them to continue that anonymity. Recently, I've started to see a lot of emails talking about the effect of ghost accounts on advertising dollars. And as somebody who runs their own business, even though I very rarely, actually spend money to advertise my blog, I've noticed that, Facebook and Instagram in particular, they've started to be very proud of the fact that they have artificial intelligence personalities on there. Like, yay, you can talk to somebody who doesn't exist. You know, about 20 years ago, if I did that, people would start giving me medication and putting me in a padded cell. Now I get to actually spend money for that opportunity. Really thankful for that, Zuck.
Yeah.
And people who are, using Instagram, Facebook, all these other social media platforms as a form of advertising, they want to get a very high ROI. And the problem is that we don't even know how many of these accounts are bot accounts anymore.
Yep.
But the obvious evidence is suggesting that it's increasing day by day.
Yep. And it's going to explode as we get closer to the elections, because
Oh
these
yeah.
are, we always see this in the 6 months running up to an election, that the bot accounts, just particularly the bot accounts being run out of Russia, just explode. So
And the interesting thing is that I'm wondering when business owners, particularly small businesses, not big businesses, because big business has never been the true wallet of America. They have done everything possible to extract wealth from the common man while they hoard everything for themselves. They don't give back. They don't give back in taxes. They don't give back in events. They might give back a little bit in culture as long as it actually benefits them.
yeah,
It's the small businesses that have always kept the US afloat. So, what happens when small businesses realize that their ROI on their advertising dollars for social media no longer warrants the amount of money that they're paying?
because so many of the hits that they're paying for are bots. You mean?
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. That's got to be an interesting conundrum. I've never seen. I mean, we have a commercial account on Facebook, and so we have the ability to boost posts and things. In other words, basically buy advertising. And I've never seen anything that tells me how they come up with how much it's going to cost and what it's going to be and all that kind of stuff. I mean, if I'm going to buy network television advertising or radio advertising, they'll provide me with statistics. Here's how many viewers we have. Here's the response, typical response rate. All that kind of stuff. And my cat is demanding attention. Hi there. So
It's okay. We have one right behind the TV, not the TV, the computer.
yeah, there you go. Yeah. Well, I'm gonna hang on just a second. Come on. Here. I'll set this down. Okay. He decided he didn't like that. So I don't want to. I'll just leave him alone. Anyway, where were we? Sorry.
So you're telling me that when you do your advertising, you notice that they never give you a clear explanation as to why you get to pay this amount of money for this amount of viewers. However, with traditional media, You get the full stats, you get the full, the numbers and the call in.
Right. Right. And so, and that's, and I think that's probably one of the reasons why you see so much direct response media when you see direct response media on television, call this number right now. Um, those we used to call those PI ads back in the. I used to own an ad agency back in the '90s, and in other words, per inquiry. So, and what we would do is, with PI advertisers, per inquiry advertisers, you go to radio or television stations or networks and say, instead of giving you $10,000 to run this ad, we will give you an audit trail. We'll create a mailbox or a phone number that you have access to, so you can see what kind of response we get, and we will pay you 10% or 20% of our response, or we'll pay you $5 per response,
Hmm.
and or per inquiry. Sometimes they're done per inquiry, sometimes they're done per sale. And so when you see a lot of that kind of advertising on TV, you generally know that that network is having a hard time selling advertising. The two big signs of a network in trouble are public service announcements, which are free, and PI ads, or per inquiry, direct response ads, which are cheap. And on social media, an awful lot of what you see is direct response. Click here to, which makes sense. I mean, that you would do that, but you're not seeing a lot of brand advertising. You're not seeing car companies going on and saying you really should check out our new electric Cadillac or whatever. And the reason why is because at least I think the reason why is because the people who buy that kind of advertising are very, very serious about their metrics,
Hmm.
and they want to know exactly who's going to read that. And the social media companies, are not.
They're opaque.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect word.
Like, it's interesting that you mentioned that because I found out a little bit about how Tinder became the phenomenon it was. And Tinder, as everybody knows, is a dating app, and it is a dating app that exists on the internet. So you'd expect it to be all social media, all this, all that. It wasn't. The reason that Tinder got big was because it got big in New York City first. They spent all of their budget on poster ads throughout the New York City subway and through New York City streets. They actually had like live things where only people would be able to view them because they're on their commute or they're heading to a club. Or in my case, they were, carrying a couple of DJs who were really, really, upset about whatever slot they got at their latest lineup. But they did that on purpose because if you think about it, Tinder being online, that means that they were going to be bound to get bots. They needed real people. And the only way that you're going to get real people to start signing up for your thing is to make sure that human eyes see it when they're going on the commute, when they go here and there. By
Mm,
creating it a hyper local experience where all of these Tinder ads were going all over New York City. That's that's how they got a large enough dating pool to satiate New York. Once they got a major one of the top 3 cities in New York in America, New York, talking about it, everything else kind of fell like dominoes.
mhm.
And it's interesting that they went to traditional advertising rather than, what one would expect. And what does that say about the efficacy of all these online things? Are we really just selling to ghosts just by trying to get Facebook ads?
Yeah. I don't know the answer. It's an interesting question. Um, it's just a very interesting time that we live
Mhm.
in. It seems like a very transitional time. We're seeing these kind of morphine of social media. We're seeing, where we started with this conversation with AI, kind of becoming an outsized influence in America, particularly in the news and information realm. And as you and I discussed earlier, the dangers associated with that, where Russian and other countries are specifically producing content just to try to train AI to their point of view. but also, you know, giant corporations doing the same thing, and now politicians doing the same thing. Um, so I don't know. It's it's an information landscape that seems like it's filled with landmines, particularly for young people, and not just the emotional landmines that Australia is concerned about, but actual information landmines where people grow up believing things that just aren't true, and
Yeah.
you know, in ways that are destructive to them, not just personally, but destructive to things like democracy. You know, having a functioning republic. So.
I agree entirely. And like, I guess my biggest question is we all see this bubble, it's forming. Most of us are already getting sick of seeing all this AI crap on their Google, their DuckDuckGo. Like recently, my phone decided that it needed more AI. And I was like, dude, I did not ask you to be a super smartphone. I asked you to be a moderately smartphone, bro. Like, don't do this to me.
Yeah,
You
I just
know?
turned off Apple Intelligence on mine.
Yeah. I've seen so many people getting frustrated. They don't ask for AI yet, it's being shoved down our throats. And I'm wondering what's going to happen when the bubble bursts and how is it going to burst?
Mhm. I, you know, I in terms of investment, in terms of the business models, in terms of all the companies out there that are trying to spin up AI type products and things like that, the data centers, the power systems that are being built to power the data centers and all that. Like we discussed earlier, I think Moore's law is going to catch up with them, and you're just going to see a lot of bankruptcies. Um, in terms of you know the desecration of the information space, you know the hijacking of the information space by not just Nazi trolls but foreign governments and corporations and politicians who have very very specific agendas that don't work to our benefit. I think we're going to see all those increasing too as well. This is that, you know, that's where the big danger is. We're kind of getting redundant here, but
I mean, yeah, the way I figured this bubble is going to be a little bit different though, because in most cases, the bubbles that we've seen burst, they've always been an economic bubble and almost entirely an economic bubble. You know what I mean? Because back in the day, McMansions, they were the big bubble. The bubble burst, but people still live in McMansions. With the .com thing, I don't need to tell you that people still go on things that are named .com. Heck, I'm pretty sure that pets.com is worth more than my mom's house is at this point, even though it's not owned by the same people. This might be the very first bubble that we see where there's actually going to be a social burst. And what I mean by that is because, like I'm a little bit more youthful than, a lot of people my age. I talk to a lot of people in their 20s simply because my husband's still in his 20s. Like, they've started to back away from all tech. And I'm not just talking about AI. I'm seeing people backing away from Facebook. I'm seeing people backing away from X, from Instagram. The people who use Facebook in the underground nightlife scene that I belong into, they use that specifically only to get party invites. And then they log off and they're like, okay, I'm going to go here, I'm going to go here, and then I'm going to wait for the signal and I'm going to find the party once somebody leads me to the place. This is going to be the very first bubble of its kind where there's actually going to be serious social ramifications. And I'm interested to see what's going to happen when people start to get wise to how much we've been played.
that's a great question. That's a very thoughtful analysis. It's brilliant.
Well, thank you, man.
I think you're right too. You know, from what I'm seeing and hearing, you know, from my kids and from people who listen to my radio program, you know, we have young callers who call in as well as the people my age, and yeah, I think that's I need to ponder that one. Thank you.
Thank you too. I guess I guess our hour's almost over. So
Yeah,
I hope I hope everybody I hope everybody got some stuff to think about because I've been thinking about this all week. I've been kind of reading up on the news, and I with the way that AI is shifting, I think that this is actually going to be a very deep paradigm shift. Um, we used to be all about, as a society, expanding our global view. Like, for the first time in history, people like me from Jersey, like, we can talk about people from the Dogon tribe out in Africa and hear about like their wisdom from the Hogan of the Dogon tribe. Or we could hear about like the unique, rituals of the Miao people from China. But the more that this revolution has started to take hold, the more I'm noticing how local centric everything has been getting. And yes, decarceration, Jersey represent. New York, Jersey Shore, where are my people at? Okay.
I get it.
But I'm wondering whether or not we're actually going to see that giant snapback of localization, that hyper local focus that I'm hoping will happen.
It would be a good thing. I mean, we need community. We're wired for it. It's the thing that has provided the guarantee of survival for the human race. For
Mhm.
hundreds of years is community. The downside of it is that wired into our DNA is this tribalism instinct where, we're constantly looking for who's the other tribe who's represents a threat to us. And that, then is easily manipulated into things like racism and misogyny and xenophobia and whatnot that, Trump and the GOP are so successful at exploiting. But, but this idea of reinventing local community is, I think, a really important one, and
Mhm.
we're seeing the foundation of it. There was, there's an app, Next Door Neighbor, I think it's called, or something like that.
Yeah, next
Uh,
door.
yeah, that had so much potential to do that, and I signed up for it. But the problem is that I don't think it's ever hit a critical mass with regard to individual neighborhoods. Like, I live in a neighborhood here in Portland that's definable. It has a name and it has a boundary, and so I go on there looking for information about my community, and it just throws all this crap at me from all the different communities in Portland that I really am not interested in. And, I mean, broadly speaking, but you want to know what's going on with your neighbors,
Mhm.
and I, I'm not sure that could ever be done online. Um,
I think you're right.
be interesting to see a return of block parties. It's like,
I mean, aside from like where I grew up in, like I've always lived in areas where there were block parties. Like I lived in Long Branch, I lived in Newark, I lived in Englewood. All those places always still had block parties. And it's very interesting because those areas tend to lean a lot more left simply because everybody tends to watch out for everybody in their own weird way. Like they'll keep you at an arm's length, but they'll still be like, "Hey, you good? You need any food? You need it, you need any resources?" I don't necessarily see that in the same areas that don't have block parties.
yeah. Well, I
So,
think there back in the late '90s, there was a British statistician and social scientist who wrote a book called Bowling Alone. And what he chronicled was that as the internet was increasing, the uh, the social participation, the bowling leagues were vanishing, and the clubs, the moose, the elk, the those kind of things, and I think that social media kind of replaced that need for us for a while, but now social media is becoming so toxic that it's just not the town square any longer.
mhm,
So it'll be interesting to see if your analysis of what's going on with the Zoomers is accurate, whether there's a resurgence or a return to service clubs, block parties, community activities, things like that. I know there's one of my kids lives in a part of Portland where there's a lot of local community activity going on, just within like a 4 square block area. And but a lot of it's focused around, it's a community that's full of young couples and that have kids. And so a lot of that stuff is focused around kids. And I'm guessing that's always been there. Um, but I don't know. It's a fascinating time to be alive.
Hmm.
For so,
Like the way I figure it right now, America is starting to realize what matters the most. And what matters the most is truth, your neighbors and your friends and your family, and actually being able to have your three hots and a cot without having to worry about all of those being removed by bad people.
yeah,
And it's so fascinating to see people start to question their morals, their beliefs, realizing that, the brown dude down the street ain't your enemy. The enemy is the guy who's making him think you're the enemy. It's basically mean girls all over again.
yeah.
Um but yeah, I I hope I was able to enlighten some people or get people thinking. As always, it's a huge pleasure just having you on. Thank you so much, Tom.
Yeah, well, thanks for inviting me, Oceana. It was great having you on my program many months ago, and it's great talking to you again. And I love reading your work. Keep it up.
Thank you so much. And I love reading your work, so hopefully we'll be able to do this again. Um, right now I actually have to zoom off into another place. That and my cat is starting to give me grief right behind the computer, so I
That's all.
gotta. And thank you, Jorge. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, T. Thomas Lewis, David. Thank you, Marnie. This has been awesome. I hope you guys have a happy Saturday. Okay.
There you go. Thanks again.
All right. Bye.